So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the session on material resources modeling. My name is Elisa Lanzi, and I'm a senior economist at the OECD Environment Directorate. Alan Golub from the Center of Global Trade Analysis is hosting and recording today's session, and will help ensure that we keep our allotted time. Before getting to the presentations, please allow me to remind you of the following session protocol and etiquette so that the session runs smoothly. All attendees except the person currently speaking must remain muted. Unless otherwise noted, presentations will last 20 minutes. The session host will verbally prompt the presenter when there are 2 minutes left remaining in their allotted time. When the allotted presentation time has elapsed, if the presentation has not already ended, the host will prompt again and will immediately move us on to the discussion periods. Discussion periods will last 10 minutes and immediately follow each presentation. Listeners must enter their question or comments to everyone in the chat board, and I, as chair, will accept questions in the order received, read the listener's name and question aloud, and then allow the presenter to respond verbally. Presenters, we encourage you to restate the question before answering. This will continue until the host prompts if 2 minutes remain, at which time I will begin wrapping up the discussion. Following all but the final presentation, there will be a 2-minute transition period to allow the next presenter time to load share their presentation. During this transition time, I will introduce the next presenter. So in this session, we will hear from 3 presenters, and without further ado, please allow me to introduce the first speaker, Alessandro Gatto from Wageningen University and Research, who will be presenting today about healthier but wasteful changes in food loss and waste along global supply chains with healthier diets. The floor is yours, Alessandro.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me well. So with the presentation I give today, I aim to illustrate you how food loss and waste along a global food supply chain change with the implementation of global healthier diets. Today we know that the modeling of material flows through the economy and of circularity itself faces several challenges. On one hand, the capturing of physical biomass flows is a consistent challenge as our dollar-based quantities are insufficient to assess global challenges related to nutrition or impact of resource circularity. Therefore, it is necessary to implement effective policy designs to quantify biomass by type, by use, and geographically, in order to also enhance consistent linkages to technical models, but also to provide a common data ground to understand how, when structural changes to the economy, like in this case a healthy diet, occur, how global biomass demand and supply behave. On the other hand, the quantification of food loss and waste presents several challenges, to the point that because no common definition or reliable global measurement is available to date, and available studies contrast in methodologies or specification of food supply chains, therefore resulting in inconsistent estimates and databases. The data we have mainly available today is mainly represented in single metrics, therefore doesn't allow to achieve a cross-disciplinary analysis on food loss and waste. And also the available estimates from Gustafsson present several limitations due to inconsistent methodology or food loss and waste definition. Moreover, we also find that there is inconsistencies between food loss and waste data and net food intake data, to the point that if we apply the currently available data, for example, in the States of food loss and waste, we would see that there is a lot of losses along the supply chain, therefore problems like obesity wouldn't rise. In this study, we aim to tackle these challenges in the following way. On capturing physical biomass flows, we trace different biomass flows, so feed, seed, other use, and food, to the global economy, quantifying their magnitude and their composition. As well, we captured intermediate and final biomass use, pointing out output changes in demand and in global trade. But then we also quantify food quantities and trace food quantities from farm to fork, so identifying also intermediate and final use. Overall, we provide a common data ground to assess the so-called 4Fs competition, so feed, food, fuel, and fiber, analyzing biomass trade and potential substitution effects between the different biomass flows. On the quantification of food loss and waste, instead, we are capable to obtain data on food intake, so improving the currently available data from the food balance sheets, which omits waste, therefore represents only food availability. And based on this food intake, we link an up-to-date global food loss and waste database in which we quantify food loss and waste at the different stages of the food supply chain in different regions of the world, so understanding the potential scope of circularity, and understanding how this food loss and waste behaves when a diet, a more sustainable and healthy diet is implemented. Therefore, how food loss and waste changes along the different stages of the supply chain. The core contribution of this study are two. The first one on capturing physical biomass flow relies in our placement of a biomass balancing equation into a CGE framework. So here you see the food balance sheets biomass equations, which placed in the GTAP framework assumes this form. This equation is taken by Gustafsson et al. In their study, in which the authors define losses by incorporating feed, seed, and other uses, but also define losses by excluding pre-harvest losses, but expand the definitions of the food balance sheets by including food waste, so at the later stages of the supply chain. Also, the authors do not consider non-edible food parts as losses. So on the limitations of the food balance sheets definition and of Gustafsson's definition of the biomass balancing equation, we come up with a new balancing equation in which we are capable to singularly account domestic and imported feed, seed, other uses, and food in order to trace changes in biomass demand, including pre-harvest losses while still accounting for food waste, so at the retail and consumption stage. And we do this by obtaining consistent physical accounting of biophysical flows from the GTAP nutritional database, to which we link a new food loss and waste database that allows us to quantify food loss and waste at the different stages of the supply chain. In practice, this equation is placed into the magnet model in the following way, behaves in the following way. So feed, seed, and other use biomass evolve with changes in domestic or imported commodity used by activity. Meanwhile, food and food loss and waste evolve with changes in private household consumption. At this point, we faced several challenges with this methodology. The first one is that our biomass balance does not hold during simulations. Therefore, what you see today is a post-sim approach that we currently adopt. Also, the structure of input-output tables is inconsistent with shares of food and other uses suggested by FAO. And the currently used Leontief inverse method to redistribute commodities to the single biomass flows is suited for comparative static approaches, but is not suited for assessing structural changes during simulations. Therefore, we're thinking potentially of improving this method by potentially use temporal Leontief inverse, which could be more suited for dynamic simulations. At the same time, we find high heterogeneity in implied prices between different biomass uses, which may not reflect reality. In practice, our biomass balancing equation allows us to quantify global biomass supply. So what you see here is our baseline, an SSP2 scenario, in which we project global biomass to 2030. And you see that global biomass increases mainly in other use and food, but also in feed, while seed production remains quite stationary. The core of the benefits of our first contribution relies in the fact that we can assess global biomass composition and different demand patterns. So, for example, to 2030, we can see that there is a relative increase in biomass demand, which is highest for food and feed, with reallocation from other uses to food and feed. And this increase in demand is mainly pushed by Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, with other use demand also drastically increasing in Southeast Asia. We also see that the allocation, for example, of imported biomass switches to feed and food in high-income countries and to food and other uses in low-income countries. And it's also important to notice that low-income regions shift their production from primary biomass, feed and seed, to processed biomass, reflecting so increasing in incomes and evolving demands. The second core contribution of the study relies in quantifying food loss and waste along the global supply chains. We do this by bringing an up-to-date global database containing estimates on percentages of losses and waste of total food weight along the different stages of the supply chain. So we start with a consistent food loss and waste definition provided by the Sustainable Development Goals. We start as a data core from the FAO Food Loss and Waste database of 2019, And we expanded the FAO database by an extensive literature review to which we enhance supply chain and commodity coverage, finally delivering a database that contains food loss and waste specified over different metrics. So we're able to specify food loss and waste in nutritional, physical, and economic terms. Placed in current literature, our database, especially against Gustafsson, which is a study performed on the same macro level, we see that most relevant data are published after 2011. Therefore, we are capable to increase global data coverage for consumption and manufacturing stage, but also for high income and middle income regions, relying on more data collection rather than assumptions, especially for the earlier stages of the supply chains, which in Gustafsson are abundantly drew by assumptions. But we also see that for the later stages of the supply chain, we are forced to, in low-income countries, we are forced to generalize data given the impossibility of the non-availability of data for those regions. From the quantification of biomass, we're capable, therefore, to obtain data on food intake and on food consumption, and project this in our baseline, seeing that, for example, consumption to 2030 shifts from primary commodities to processed commodities, especially vegetables. We see that this means that there is a reallocation of processed food biomass from feed and other uses to food. We also see that there is a global increase in food supply from food services, mainly in high-income countries. Interesting is also to notice that animal primary and processed biomass follows a linear growth, so there is no drastic substitution effect in food bundles with rising incomes. So from this food consumption structure, we are capable to link food loss and waste data and obtain food loss and waste data for each stages of the supply chain in different regions. And to 2030, for example, we see that our results align with current literature. For example, we still see that earlier stages of the supply chain represent the highest share of losses for low-income regions. We see that the shift in consumption towards processed food means that both domestic and imported food loss and waste will be greater on the manufacturing stage. And we see that this can be potentially a problem for the spatial scope of circularity, in the sense that that food are processed somewhere else, so therefore waste is located somewhere else compared to where actually waste is consumed. And as well, it could be a potential problem for circularity because waste comes out of a processing stage. Therefore, its use might be compromised as feed or as potential fertilizer. This baseline in this study is compared against a scenario where we implement a sustainable, healthy diet. So we use the magnet model aggregated to the GTAP model using GTAP version 10 data, with basic drivers being population, total factor productivity, and crops and livestock yields. And we compare our baseline to a sustainable healthy diet. Their year is defined as moving halfway to the Eat Lancet diet recommendation. Is named in this way for the following reason. So we start with the implementation of a shock by fixing of the Eat Lancet diet by fixing private household consumption per capita with the Eat Lancet recommendations, splitting and adapting the Eat Lancet commodity framework to the GTAP commodity framework. So, for example, sweeteners in the Eat Lancet are reframed and split between raw sugar and processed sugar. But also we report consumption from food services and processed food in primary equivalence. Therefore, we are capable to target with the Eat Lancet recommendation also consumption from these sources. A current issue at this point is that the Eat Lancet, the full Eat Lancet shock is not implementable in the GTAP framework because high-income regions do not reach the level of income necessary to consume the Eat Lancet. Therefore, what we do is we split the shock of the Eat Lancet, therefore moving halfway to the Eat Lancet diet. And that's where the name of the scenario comes from. The first results of our scenario analysis are the following. So here you can see global biomass supply in our baseline and the Eat Lancet diet scenario. So we see that the Eat Lancet diet scenario overall decreases global biomass supply. And we also see that there is a reallocation of other uses and feed the biomass towards food, indicating that food increases, but also that currently countries are consuming less than the Eat Lancet diet. Several countries are consuming less than the Eat Lancet recommendation diet. Seed as well remains stationary as in our baseline scenario. In terms of biomass composition, we see that the Lancet diet itself shifts the sourcing of biomass towards import. So countries start importing more biomass rather than producing it domestically. We see that food and feed demand is still mainly pushed by increasing demand in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, with other use demand not increasing as well as a business as usual scenario, but decreasing mainly in high income regions. We see that there is a biomass reallocation effect, so a substitution effect with shares of biomass decreasing in other use and feed and being reallocated towards food. But we also see that in high-income countries, there is a source substitution effect in the sense that high-income countries decrease their production, their domestic production on feed and other use and start increasing their imports. Meanwhile, low-income countries expand their domestic supply of biomass, at the same time expanding also imports. In terms of food consumption, the Lancet diet has the following effects. So we see that first, the Lancet diet shifts consumption towards primary commodities, so globally decreasing consumption of processed meat, processed vegetables, and processed food. This new consumption structure so shifts consumers' preference towards crops and horticulture and dairies, but drastically varies the consumption source of primary commodities. As you can see here in the bottom graph, now countries start importing way more food than producing it domestically. We can see that also in terms of production of processed foods, it decreases in high-income countries, but still increases in low-income countries, meaning that low-income countries are still consuming less processed food than what advised by the Lancet, and also start exporting more processed food to high-income countries. For example, also food consumption from food services, which was drastically increasing in our business as usual scenario, we see that it decreases with the Lancet as consumers now prefer to consume primary commodities. This translates in the following results for food loss and waste. Overall, we can say that there is a global increase in food loss and waste along the food supply chain with a healthy diet. This is because the consumption of horticultural commodities mainly and dairies increases food loss and waste, despite all processed commodities, both vegetables and meat, decrease. Overall, the Lancet diet pushes food loss and waste from the manufacturing stage, which was among the main stages reporting losses given the preference of consumers for processed food, but it shifts instead towards consumption. So there is a different allocation of waste amounts now a consumption stage rather than manufacturing stages, also again reflecting the fact that consumers consume less processed food. In terms of spatial availability of waste, it is interesting to notice that the rising demand for primary commodities increases the local availability of food loss and waste at the early stages of the food supply chain. So, for example, if low-income countries are now producing horticultural commodities to be exported, low-income countries face highest losses at the early stages of the supply chain. Therefore, food loss and waste would be available for low-income countries for potential circular loops. If then these vegetables are exported to high-income countries and consumed in high-income countries, where the highest food loss and waste rate are at the later stages of the supply chain, so at consumption stage, it means that also for high-income countries, there is availability of food loss and waste. Therefore, overall, there could be a potential benefit in terms of availability of waste for implementing circularity based on this waste. And also we can say that in quality terms, food loss and waste could increase its employability because now waste comes from primary commodities rather than processed commodities. So the likelihood of employing waste it's higher, of employing waste as organic fertilizer or feed. Concluding, we can draw the following conclusions. On food security, we can say that a healthy and sustainable diet increases global food availability, but only through increasing global trade. So food security does not coincide with food sovereignty. In terms of food loss and waste, instead, we can say that global food loss and waste tend to increase with a healthy and sustainable diet, to bring in potential other impacts on the environment. But on the positive note is that the spatial availability of food loss and waste can assist the creation of domestic material loops for circular purposes, as well as the quality, the type of food loss and waste can enhance its employability as production input. In terms of environmental sustainability, we can say that the healthy and sustainable diet reduces overall global demand for biomass, therefore decreasing potential pressures on the environment. But these potential pressures are decreased only if food loss and waste generated now mainly from horticultural commodities, which also is commonly associated with highest greenhouse gas emissions, is properly reused as a secondary input material. From here, the next step to improve these studies and the analysis are the following. So first, concerning food loss and waste data, we need to compare and update our estimates with newly released estimates from the United Nations released this year. In terms of modeling biomass flows and food loss and waste, we need to develop a methodological approach that allow us to target and account structural changes in biomass flows during simulation, but also create a consistent link between calorie intakes and food loss and waste estimates. So calibrating data in a way that both data could potentially reflect reality. In terms of the heat-Lancet scenario, which now faces ad hoc adjustments, we need to potentially shock either other variables or reframe commodities to be shocked in order to run the full shock of the heat-Lancet diet, but also to deliver a more integrated analysis, which will be the core of the forthcoming paper of this study. We are need to create more ad hoc indicators that can fully assess the trade-offs and the synergies between nutritional, environmental, and food reduction targets. On this, I welcome you. I thank you for your attention and welcome any questions, comments, or suggestions for improving my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro, for a very nice presentation and also perfect timing. So let's go ahead and take some questions. There's already a question in the chat. So just as a reminder, please enter all questions and comments in the chat and I'll read them out. So the question that's there already is, was it so that in scenario simulation, total global biomass supply increases? What is the rationale behind that? More land use for crops, etc., or more efficient production?
I have a problem that I cannot see the screen of the meeting right now, so I would like to also read the question because, or can you just repeat it? Sorry.
Sure. So the context of the question is the scenario simulation showing. First of all, does the scenario show that total global demand supply increases?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So the question is, what is the rationale behind that? And specifically, more land use for crops, etc., or more efficient production?
So the rationale between, given our drivers of our baseline, the rationale between the increasing biomass are mainly income. So we see that the accessibility, especially of low-income regions and such as Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, increasing income and increasing populations will require more food. And this is basically linked also to feed and seed production. Therefore, the rationale is that the purchasing power of the population increases, and therefore there is more accessibility of to specific commodities. In particular, processed foods are also carrying on other biomass flows, with not only food biomass, but again also feed. And processed commodities as well, so other use consumptions, so products that come from biomass, such as shampoos, for example, weren't used before, and now populations start having the accessibility to this. Therefore, there is an increase also in other use. And it's also actually interesting to notice that in our baseline, other use is the one that increases the most. So actually, consumers start having the access to these goods. Therefore, that's the rationale behind the increase of global biomass.
All right. There's also a follow-up question always on this topic. So, does this healthier diet imply more pressure on land use and ecosystems?
We did not explicitly monitor these variables, but would assume that the healthier diet itself, in terms of, as I said before, in terms of environmental impact or land use, could potentially decrease it, because since less biomass is demanded, less land would be needed to produce this biomass. But also, yes, it also relies around what is the future use of this waste at the end, because if we do not correctly reuse the repurpose waste into the framework, into the economic production framework, we have waste going to landfill, which is actually potentially, with the Eat-Lancet diet, generating more greenhouse gas emissions than the business as usual scenario, because of the type of waste. So we have the opportunity, higher opportunity, to reuse waste, given the fact that it is more employable as, for example, feed or seed. But at the same time, if we don't do it, it could have worse consequences than a business as usual scenario.
All right, thank you. There was a hand up. Rob, do you want to, Rob Dilling, do you want to read out your question?
Sure, not sure. The previous session we had everybody raises their hands instead of chatting. But I have two quick questions. One I just posed in the chat, and the second one that will not surprise Hans. The first question is, a lot of people that I know, if you shift towards a healthier diet, you're also more conscious about your food consumption and thereby trying to reduce your food waste. So does it make sense to combine the scenario you have on healthier diets with some lifestyle changes towards avoiding food waste? And then the second question is, can you use this framework to assess the impacts of COVID on food waste? I'd be really keen to see that. Thanks.
So with the first question, that's a really good point, in the sense that we hope that people that would adopt a healthy and sustainable diet would be more aware about sustainability, therefore would be less keen to waste food. The problem with horticultural waste is with non-edible food parts. That's why I was also remarking the fact that Gustafsson does not include non-edible food part as waste, is because that if we switch to consuming bananas, which are more healthy for sure, the problem is that we do not eat banana peel anyway. So that despite we go to healthier consumption and we are aware of the environmental impact of certain things, we are still forced to dismantle the banana peel, and as well other sorts of vegetables. So I think that the impact in terms of consumption of vegetables will still remain high in this case, despite people are more aware of sustainability and so on. For the impact of COVID, would be interesting also to see in terms of more about the sourcing of food loss and waste. So if we see that basically the COVID crisis increased awareness on the food supply chain, on food security, so people are starting to consume more domestically because the COVID crisis could be linked to the mitigation of ecosystems and so on. So we could see that also consumers could shift to more domestic consumptions, and therefore also could potentially have a nice impact on food loss and waste generation, in the sense that we could have more waste locally available, therefore could be less costly to implement circular loops domestically. But indeed, it's really nice. It's really nice to see how shifting consumptions, which are linked to different variables or different scenarios, can affect food loss and waste.
All right, thanks. There's another question, a clarification on what is the main driver behind the increase of food loss and waste in the Eat-Lancet scenario. Maybe I'll read out the following one as well. What does the Eat-Lancet diet imply for developing countries, for example, India and Sub-Saharan Africa?
But the Lancet, it's implemented globally. What is different with the same directives, because at the end it's a global diet specified by the authors. What is different is the current consumption of certain countries, therefore the different the level of shocks. So, for example, if India already consumes an amount of rice that is almost the Lancet, we just shock less compared to, for example, Italy, where rice consumption is way below India. So there it's shocked more. But at the end, the result is that the whole world starts consuming the same amount. It's just the trajectory to arrive to these amounts is different for sure. Therefore, also we needed to calculate ad hoc stocks for each region, because each region has a different consumption structure.
Right, thank you. So there are no more questions. I think we should move to the next presentation. So we're still on the topic of circularity, but changing a bit from food to materials. And I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Maxime Chevalier from the Center for Global Trade Analysis of Purdue University, who will be presenting on circular economy transition in the Eastern European member states. Maxime, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lisa. I hope you can see my screen, correct? Great. Yeah, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is a joint work with my colleagues from the center, Angel Aguiar, Dominique van der Merkbroek, and Li Wang, and also with World Bank team represented by Andrea Liverani and Thomas Farole. So in this presentation, we will focus on two separate parts. One is the database development, so to address the issue of the circular economy transition in Eastern Europe, but also in Europe in general and worldwide, we need to develop their corresponding database. So the first part of the presentation will largely focused on this, and just to mention, essentially, most of our efforts so far has gone into the database development, while the second part would focus on the circularity in the Eastern European member states with an overview of the current situation and also some preliminary assessment of some possible implications of their CE policy measures in Eastern Europe. So in terms of their database development and motivation behind their circular economy work in general. So the current material use patterns are projected to put a tremendous pressure on the Earth's ecosystem. So there have been multiple studies that have projected different trajectories for their material use, but all show that in the current with the current trends, they would increase quite significantly, for instance, 2.5 times based on Stefan et al. Paper. And of course, this would put a significant major pressure on for climate mitigation and also other conservation efforts. So there is a need to move towards a more sustainable material consumption patterns. And this is widely recognized and promoted within the circular economy concept. At the same time, the modeling of the circular economy transition requires an explicit representation of this primary and secondary production activities. So this explicit representation of this split, including country-specific production volumes for primary and secondary activities, and also corresponding supply and cost structures, for instance, for aluminum, plastics, and so on. And so far, such representation is not available in most global economic models and the GTAP database in particular. So there has been multiple previous efforts on representing the circular economy flows and then modeling them. So one of the most widely used input-output frameworks for assessing different circular economy and primary secondary transition is EXIOBASE MRIO, so a number of studies relied on it. And later in this presentation, we'll discuss what are the benefits and drawbacks of EXIOBASE and how our effort differs from the EXIOBASE. There has been also some TGE-based assessments focusing on some specific sectors or commodities, for instance, Winning et al. Paper with a focus on steel. And of course, a lot of work has been also done by our OECD colleagues using GTAP-based assessment with the corresponding dynamic TGE model. And they have implemented corresponding splits into their GTAP database, focusing on metals and then later on plastics. So that has been a great source of information as for the starting point of our work as well. At the same time, there are selected limitations of the existing approaches, which we are trying to address in our framework. So first, efforts that are based on the EXIOBASE cost structures and output values are somewhat have issues in the sense that EXIOBASE cost structures and output values do not represent actually observed data in many cases, and it's nicely, for instance, in Winning et al. Paper for the steel production. Also, there has been focus on selected commodities or specific regional aggregations, so not a full global database. And the last but not least, these databases are not publicly available. So essentially, by developing the GTAP-CE database, we are trying to fill the gap of public availability so that the modeling teams that rely on GTAP can have access to this database. So in terms of the sectoral splits that we are implementing in this database effort, and of course, this can be extended, so multiple other commodities can be introduced, like rubber, paper, and so on. But in this particular split, we are focusing on metals and plastics. So we are splitting as the extraction sector by different ores. We are also splitting rubber and plastics into primary, secondary, and recycling. Doing the same for steel and also various non-ferrous metals, aluminum, copper, other metals, and also separating casting of steel and non-ferrous metals. And we are doing it for the GTAP Power database. So this brings the total number of sectors to 95, and we have a disaggregated representation of the electricity sector. So briefly on the database construction steps, so we start, of course, from the data collection. So essentially, we replicate all the work that, for instance, EXIOBASE developers might have done, and well, that they have done. In terms of that, we combine different data sources that provide volumes of primary and secondary production, volumes of waste, recycling rates, and also bilateral trade data for sectors of interest, USGS, UNIDOC, BLACE for trade, material flow accounts from UNEP, Prodcom, World Steel, and a number of other data sources, in particular country-specific, for instance, for plastic recycling. And then we develop the production targets using volume data, and also we derive the price data based mostly on their trade flows and number of other sources. So in the next step, we develop cost structures and supply and use structures. And we, in this approach, we rely not only on the EXIOBASE, but we are mainly based on selected disaggregated input-output tables that are available for US, Korea, Japan, and Canada. So each of these tables has at least several sectors of interest explicitly represented. So we try to capture those cost structures in our framework. We also complement it with the EXIOBASE, for instance, for the secondary versus primary production cost structures, and also add some specific cost structure assumptions based on selected technological, techno-economic analysis or other data sources. So we then combine their output targets and supply use structures, reconcile them together, and use to split the GTAP database in a splitcom run. And where necessary, we also are considering further refinement using GTAP adjust, if relevant. And then we, on the final step, incorporate energy and emission flows for the disaggregated sector. So just to briefly mention a number of selected challenges that we faced while the construction of the GTAP-CE. And the main one is that there are inconsistencies between trade, output, and underlying GTAP data. So currently, we just split the GTAP sectors. So if we aggregate database back to the original sectoral aggregation, it would match the GTAP. But if we want to really target much more precisely the output volumes and also their cost structures, we need a more elaborate balancing routines, which would allow us also to retarget other sectors. And for instance, we are using this approach to develop the GTAP bio database. So we also do adjustments outside the sectors of interest. So one other limitation to mention before I move forward is that value of output and intermediate supply of the GTAP water and recycling sector, which theoretically should capture the value of scrap and the value of recycling, is much lower than the targeted value. So for instance, when we have looked into the value of iron and steel scrap produced in US and then compared to what is the intermediate use of water activity by their total iron and steel sector in US in their IO table, it was like 50 times lower. So essentially, although theoretically we should split this sector from the water, we ended up splitting all recycling sectors from the corresponding primary activities to be able to match the values. So I'll skip the other limitations and move to the next slide, where we provide comparisons with the EXIOBASE. And as I mentioned, EXIOBASE is really a great source of information, and it provides 163 sectors, 49 countries, so mostly OECD, so not reporting many developing countries. But at the same time, first there are some for instance, negative values in the value added, like for labor, for salary, even for consumption or output. So it might be consistent with the input-output framework, but not always appreciated by the TGE models. But what's more, some output values and cost structures do not seem always plausible. So for instance, on this slide, you can see comparison between primary and secondary activities output global totals between EXIOBASE and what we have constructed. And as you can see, so the red rectangulars, they represent the share of secondary production in EXIOBASE and in GTAP. And as you can see, in all cases, according to our estimates, the share is much, much higher than what is reported in EXIOBASE. So essentially, if we would use EXIOBASE for the initial split, we would end up with 3 to 5 times lower shares than at least what is suggested, for instance, by USGS and other data sources. So in this sense, one should use EXIOBASE with some caution. So in brief overview of the GTAP-CE database in terms of emission intensities before I move to the second part of their policy application. So here we compare the production-based emission intensities and consumption-based emission intensities in kilogram per $1 by the commodities of interest. So separating primary and secondary production. So as you can see, in most cases, so first, in most cases, secondary production is, as one might expect, less carbon intensive, both for production-based and consumption-based emissions. But essentially, this is not always the case. For instance, in some cases, variations are relatively low, like for other metals, both production and consumption-based emissions seems to be relatively close, and that's because the secondary production might use much more electricity, and then if electricity generation is more carbon intensive in a specific country, this would impact the total supply chain intensity. And another point is that while in some cases when we move from production to consumption-based intensities, the gap decreases, for instance, for steel, for other cases it increases, for instance, for aluminum. And it depends, again, on the supply chain of the corresponding commodity production. So now moving to the second part, circularity in the Eastern European member states. So in terms of EU circular economy initiatives, in 2015, there was a European Commission has adopted a circular economy action plan, which was then updated in 2020 and is one of the main blocks of the EU Green Deal. At the same time, there are no country-specific targets there, and the level of efforts towards circular economy transition is something decided by national and some national governments. So the starting point in terms of what the circular material use rate by different EU countries is rather different by EU members. And you can see here identified 4 countries of interest that we would be focusing on. This is Poland, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania. So they are all in the middle or below the middle level medium of their recycling rates. So in terms of legislations, there is an overview of circular economy strategies or action plans that have been adopted in the EU member states. And just to note that most Eastern European countries so far have not adopted circular economy strategies or action plans. So their kind of policies are still under development. At the same time, just to note, it seems that among policymakers, they are not well equipped with the sufficient knowledge of possible implications of the circularity policies on the economy. There was a recent study that made a corresponding review and a questionnaire among policymakers, and this was one of the key concerns in terms of moving forward on the circularity front. So a brief overview of the primary and secondary output composition for the commodities of interest in the 4 countries that we are focusing on. So in terms of plastics, the share of secondary production is relatively uniform across countries between 20 and 25%. At the same time, for metals, there are high variations, not only in the composition of metals production, but also in primary versus secondary split. For instance, in Croatia, we can see that the share of aluminum secondary production is really high, while totals for steel are much lower than, for instance, in Poland or Romania. So to better understand what would be the implication of circular economy transition, it's good to look into consumption-based emission intensities by commodities and by countries. And here, the trends that we have observed at the global level, that in most cases, secondary production is less carbon intensive than primary production, does not hold all over across the board. Yeah, so for instance, in case of Poland, at least what our estimates suggest is that the secondary steel production is somewhat more carbon intensive than the primary steel production, while for all other commodities, it's the opposite case. Yeah. And then we can find some other commodity cases, for instance, in Croatia, for copper, secondary production seems to be more carbon intensive. Of other metals. So although on average, still primary production is less carbon intensive, it's not a general case. And why is it happening? This is mostly, as I mentioned, due to the different shares of electricity generation. So although secondary production might use much less fossil fuels, it can be more electricity intensive. And then if their electricity generation mix is kind of more relying on fossil fuel generation, then it might increase their carbon intensity of the secondary production. And for most Eastern European countries, they have a relatively high reliance on coal and gas-based generation. So this is essentially the case. Also, just to mention 2 other points is that particularly in the case of Bulgaria and Romania, the plastics carbon intensity seems to be relatively high, both for primary and secondary. So essentially, like for instance, in Bulgaria, higher than for steel, and in Romania, relatively close to steel. So So the plastic, we might also expect that the plastic sector might be impacted rather significantly if we, for instance, impose a carbon price in these countries.
2 minutes, Maxim.
Thank you. So moving to the sample policy simulation, and this is with static GTAP, with static envisage model, 42 activities, 30 commodities, and 20 regions. So what essentially we've done, we imposed an EU-wide carbon price ranging from $20 to $200. We also, in another set of simulations, imposed subsidy to their secondary production activity, and then we have combined 1 and 2. So I'll briefly just describe what are the results. So first, what we observe is that the carbon price indeed reduces the general material intensity, material production and material use. So there is a dematerialization of production. At the same time, there are no significant shift towards secondary production versus primary, because as we have seen, there is no much gap between carbon intensity of secondary and primary production. And plastics in the 2 countries that we have just discussed is impacted quite significantly in terms of output. So then when we look into the subsidy increase, we see that, well, there is quite a good shift over secondary production when we implement subsidy to the recycling. On average, like 40% subsidy would increase the share anyway between 15 to 25%. At the same time, this does not have a major impact on emissions. Actually, emissions might even increase in some cases, because if we do not have environmental regulations, we essentially make the secondary production cheaper, and then there is an increasing demand for this. Though welfare implications are not very significant from this policy. So the carbon pricing seems to be inefficient in abating CO2 and reducing overall material demand, but has a minor impact on recycling. On the other hand, subsidy to secondary production has even minor negative impact on CO2, but increases the share of recycling. So the combination of essential carbon pricing and environmental regulations plus incentives to the recycling really would provide an additive effect for the 2 sets of measures. So to conclude, what are the next steps? So on the database side, we are planning to refine our splits and essentially make the database a public release, so make it available to the GTAP community to use in their modeling efforts. So on the modeling side, we are involved in a project with World Bank on developing of the dynamic simulations with a dynamic baseline, and then policy simulations in the context of EU Green Deal and climate mitigation, and also assessment of some circular economy related policy measures, in particular in these 4 Eastern European countries. So these results would be coming up soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maxim. It was a great presentation, and I think this data set would be very, very valuable for more analysis to be done on the topic. There are already a couple of questions in the chat. Rob, do you want to speak up?
Sure. Thanks, Maxim. We've been talking about this database before, and I think it's a great database, and it will be very helpful for us. Especially what you're doing with recycling, that sounds very interesting. My question is, you're looking at the environmental consequences of the split between primary and secondary, and you're focusing on greenhouse gases or CO2. And of course, we all know that secondary metals are relatively energy intensive, but the environmental benefits are in terms of reduced pollution at mining. They are in terms of reduced reliance on scarce foreign resources, for example. So by narrowing the discussion on the environmental consequences to CO2, aren't you kind of putting too much pressure on the secondary, suggesting that they're not as good as people say, when you're just basically excluding most of the most relevant benefits that are there for the circular economy condition?
Yes, that's a very good point, and we are planning to include both non-CO2 greenhouse gases, process CO2 emissions, and air pollutant into our assessment. So this is what we are planning to do. So this was just for the illustrative application, but definitely looking into air pollutants would be a very important point.
Matthias?
Thanks, Elisa, and thanks, Maxime. Yeah, I can just second Rob. This would be a very welcome data set, and looking forward to see that one. I was having a question on the different energy or emissions data that you use, and what drives the difference between the different countries, or whether you are having additional data sets that you use there for targeting, such as any additional data on energy use or so, or is that coming mostly from EXIOBASE or the aggregate GTAP sector, which your disaggregated sectors would calibrate or would aggregate back to? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthias, for the support of the work. So in terms of the energy versus and emission accounts, so what we do, we preserve the GTAP totals. And then based on our cost structure splits, we also split their energy and emission accounts. So for instance, we implement the cost structure for primary and secondary steel production. We taking into account that, for instance, primary steel uses more fossil fuels and more ore, and the secondary uses more capital, for instance, and then we balance the corresponding energy accounts based on these splits. So essentially, we use the GTAP data and split it based on our cost structure assumptions.
Thank you, Ruben.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Maxime, for a great presentation. We really, all of us appreciate the work that you're putting in delivering this database. It will be incredibly useful to all of us. I have two questions. The first one is on the database itself. I didn't quite understand. So I understand there is issue with EXIOBASE, and there are lots of issues with EXIOBASE. And you said that the targets for recycling were exceeding what was in the water system, which is an issue we didn't have in our own modeling because we used the previous issue of GTAP, where recycling was with other manufacturing, so the sector was much bigger. Did you decide in the end that plastic recycling would come out of the whole plastic sector? Is that your assumption?
Yeah.
And the second.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So go ahead. Maybe I'll address the first and then we'll go for second. So yes, we split it all secondary, all recycling and all secondary from the corresponding primary sector. And this was not only issue with plastics. So for instance, for metals, this was the same issue. So I mean, my guess is that in the IO tables, probably due to the construction, the recycling and water does not capture actually the value of scrap. Yeah, it's only like the service that is used to recycle, and not even like the transportation, because in recycling there should be a relatively high share of transportation and trade, and the water still does not show this pattern. So I mean, something strange is going on there. So essentially, like it doesn't show the same values as one might expect. So we ended up splitting it from the corresponding primary sector. And primary sector is relatively big, and there is also this pattern of self-consumption in almost all primary sectors of split, especially in metals. So I think it's also like from the economic point of view, a relevant interpretation, well, that this self-consumption can be attributed to the value of scrap that is actually used from the corresponding production. So that's kind of an economic justification that we are providing. But of course, this is something that can be discussed and revised here.
Thank you,
Thank
Max.
you very much. It's clear. Can I ask my second question? Or
Yeah, there's still a couple minutes.
It's a question we got asked also when we were modeling materials, primary and secondary. And in the end, so I'm asking a question and then I'll explain. Are you currently modeling any capacity constraint for secondary materials as linked to the use of primary materials? Because we got asked that question in our own modeling, and in the end, what we did was to just check ex post that the quantities of secondary materials made sense roughly with the availability of scrap. But I wanted to know if maybe you've thought more about this or did something different, and interested in your experience.
Yeah, so that's an important question. So far, we have not introduced, at least on the database side, any explicit constraints that would capture this. So essentially, we have a separate recycling sector for each of the splitted activities. So in the sense that we link the volume of scrap or processed waste into the corresponding recycling sector. So it's not kind of like aggregated like in a single sector, but we can explicitly track this. And we also have the cost structure for this sector. In terms of constraints, apart from primary supplies, there are also trades. There is also trade. There is also supply from other sectors. So, for instance, like machinery can supply scrap, into some metals. So, I think that having kind of a logical constraint, as you did, would be an appropriate way to go. And also, in most cases, recycling rates are still not so high. Maybe going post 2060 would give some troubles in this sense, but at least going as we so far plan up to 2030, 2040 should not pose this issue. But the point well taken.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. There are no more questions, but a remark that I would second, which is thanks for the very interesting work presented, and we look forward to seeing the database. There is actually another question, but I believe we should move on to the next presentation. Host, you are the timekeeper.
We have like 3 minutes before we need to start transition to the next presentation.
Okay, great.
Rob,
So
Rob, you can ask your question maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to hold up this session. If you want to move on, that's fine. But Maxime, the one thing I was thinking of is when we did our modeling, we couldn't look at secondary concrete. And if you look at materials flows from a volume perspective, which is what the International Resource Panel, for example, constantly does, it's all about megatons. And concrete, the input for concrete, you're talking about huge volumes, and they're really dominant. Now, you can't substitute secondary concrete immediately for the primary, but you do use it a lot in downcycling, like road filler, etc. So for the modeling, perhaps it's maybe not that interesting because it's not a perfect substitute. But for the database, it would be great if we had some insights into the size of recycled concrete, secondary concrete.
Interesting point. We have not looked into concrete, so and I suppose that on the data side it would be pretty different from, for instance, metals. So that's to explore. But thanks for pointing this out.
I think that's also an interesting sector because it's so connected to economic growth. So it is an interesting material to look at. All right.
Please release the current database before you start working on concrete.
All right. So no pressure, right, Maxime? So we are now transitioning from materials more in general to a presentation that will look more specifically at plastics. So I'd like to introduce the last speaker of the session, Ruben Vivas from the OECD, who will present projections of plastics use and policy scenarios to 2060. So Ruben, the floor is yours. You're muted. Can you please start again?
Thank you. So I'll present today our work on plastics use and waste to 2060, both baseline projections and policy scenarios. This is joint work with Elisa, who's chairing this session, Eleonora, Daniel, and Rob that are also in the session. So I'll first motivate a bit why we're looking at plastics, then explain the methodology, presents results for both the baseline and the circular plastics policy scenario, and then conclude with main messages and our next steps. So first, the motivation. It's a bit similar with materials, but it's even more drastic. Before 1950, there's basically no industrial use of plastics. And between the 1950s and today, plastics use has increased to over 400 megatons per year of use. That includes fibers, additives, everything you can think of, from clothing, plastics in construction, plastics in car equipment. So it's quite an important number. And not only is the number relevant, but the widespread use of plastics is linked to an inadequate management of the end-of-life waste, which has led to plastic pollution. So we've all seen the wild animals that are, or wild turtles that are dying because of plastics bags or fishing nets that they're trapped in. But it's not only that, but there is also a more pervasive pollution from plastics that also can impact marine wildlife, as well as livelihoods and even human health, animal and human health. For instance, we don't really know the impacts of microplastics released in the environment. If we look at the current literature, plastics use or waste, actually plastic waste, most of the projection in the literature link directly plastic waste to GDP per capita. And those are the main articles that are saying, basically, we're going to be drowning in plastic in the next decades. And we wanted to go a bit further and try and improve this analysis by linking plastic, not only plastic waste to GDP per capita, but have a decent modeling of plastic use and link it to sectoral drivers. So that's the academic rationale behind our work. Finally, there's also a political rationale. There has been global political target that has been set, called the Osaka Blue Ocean Vision, pushed forward by Japan. And the goal is to reduce additional pollution by plastic litter into the oceans to zero by 2050. So it's quite ambitious when you consider all of the different plastics that we all use and that can be mismanaged and whose waste can be mismanaged in the future. So we use our global CG model with a 2060 time horizon. So it's the ENV linkages model that's developed in-house at the OECD. For this project, we are disaggregating we use the GTAP-10 database, disaggregated to 15 regions. And there are 2 steps in our general modeling, and I'll explain how we go to plastics. So in general, we have a lot of different assumptions on demographics, labor, capital accumulation, total factor productivity that feed into a macro model. that is providing growth projections to 2060, and we calibrate the ENV linkages model on those growth projections. And then the CG model ENV linkages has been enhanced with assumption on demand and production of plastics, as well as plastics use data, so both in megatons, but also we split primary and secondary sectors in plastics. We split our PP into primary and secondary technologies. And doing so allows us to not only do economic projections, but look at plastics use and waste projections. And this is what I'm going to present today. I just wanted to mention that for the moment, we've included COVID in our projections, but not in our future growth projections. We've included them as shocks in the CG model. So those are a few different types of shocks, including shocks on sectoral shocks, trade shocks, productivity shocks. There's a few. Now, going to plastics a bit further, there are several steps in our methodology. The first one is to link plastics use in megatons to the drivers of plastic demand, which in the CG are in dollars. So we project sectoral and regional economic developments with the ENV linkages model. So those are in dollars. Then we associate these volumes to sectoral, we associate plastics volumes in megatons to sectoral demand. This is quite an endeavor because we have to map the different flows of the different polymers, the different applications of plastics to the corresponding sectors in GTAP. And it's not as straightforward as probably most of you think about, oil extraction. That's one sector. It's easy to identify. Plastics is a bit more complicated because there are a lot of different applications. For instance, packaging goes into a lot of different sectors, whether it be food production or packaging for, sending parcels through the mail and any other kind of industries that use packaging in their day-to-day life. So it's quite, there are a lot of assumptions, but that's what we're doing. The next step, because the next step is to link the projected plastics volumes to plastic waste. And the way we do that is to calculate waste flows, relying on the product lifetime methodology. So for each product, they can remain in use for up to a year, for instance, for packaging, to 15 to 30 years for machinery and equipment, to more than that, 40 years, even more for construction. And so we are able to track the stocks of plastics used, and with that to calculate plastic waste that is generated. The last step in our modeling is to break down the end of life of this waste by the several types of treatment that by which they can be managed. So they can be recycled, incinerated, or landfilled. And unfortunately, a little share of that is either mismanaged or littered. And those two last categories are the ones that create lead to leakage of plastics into the environment. So in terms of results, this is for the baseline projections. This graph is quite striking. You can see that from the 2019 value of 430 megatons of plastics used globally, plastics use is projected to increase, not quite triple, but close to triple, to reach 1,150 megatons by 2060. The use of plastics in OECD countries is doubling over the time period, but the lion's share of the growth is borne by non-OECD countries. Among those, India, for which plastics use increases by 5.5, Middle East and Africa, plastics use is increasing by 5, other Asia by 3.7, and interestingly, China is also only doubling its plastics use, projected to double its plastics use, but in terms of volume, it's actually quite important because their current share is quite large as well. What does it mean for waste? Waste, of course, with a delay, increases as well from about 300 megatons to over 900 megatons. In our baseline projections, we are anticipating the effect of current policies, not more than current policies, but that means that the share of recycling is going to double. So that's the blue at the bottom, and because the share is going to double and the total waste is going to increase so much by almost 3, almost 3. The total volumes of recycled plastics are going to increase by a factor 6. Sanitary landfilling and incineration are projected to increase as well to deal with that increasing level of plastic waste. And I want to draw your attention on the red band, which corresponds to mismanaged, which is the one that leads to most leakage into the environment. The share is decreasing, is halving over time. However, because total waste is increasing, the volumes are doubling from about 60 megatons today to 115 megatons in 2060. So that's quite an increase. And if we look at regional disaggregation, in this chart, you can see for OECD and non-OECD countries, the various levels of end-of-life fates. You'll see that recycling is doubling for both OECD and non-OECD countries, reaching about 1/3 of total plastic waste in 2060. However, where the situation is completely different, it's for mismanaged waste. So it's the dark gray at the bottom. In OECD countries on the left, the share is today 5% and we are projecting that it reaches below 1% by 2060. So it's a problem that's decreasing over time. However, in non-OECD countries, the volumes are doubling. Despite the halving of the share, the volumes are doubling. And that's a very, very big issue. So what can we do to curb this increase in mismanaged waste? We modeled a policy package to target plastics throughout its lifetime. So at the use phase, the production phase, use phase, waste generation phase, as well as waste management. And the main goal of the package is to reduce mismanaged waste by 2060 through several types of instruments, both market and non-market instruments. Plastic taxes on all plastics, which are targeting to decrease the use of plastics. Taxes on primary and subsidies on secondary plastics in order to shift plastics from primary to secondary materials or secondary plastics. And in terms of waste management, we modeled investments to improve waste collection and enhance recycling, which would decrease mismanaged waste. We also looked at how we can reduce waste, or at least delay both decrease and delay the generation of waste by implementing both eco-design measures and repair measures that increase the lifetime of plastics while decreasing the demand. So if you think about a car that contains today a lot of plastics, if you increase its lifetime by 2 years, you could imagine that it decreases your demand for cars, the overall demand for cars by a corresponding amount. So all these instruments are modeled in our ENV linkages model. And in terms of plastic use, we reach a global decrease of 17% of plastic use. And because currently our measures are homogeneous globally, so they have this, for instance, the same level of taxes on use in both OECD countries and non-OECD countries. The drop in plastic use is more important in non-OECD economies such as India and emerging Asia in the future. We look at also plastic waste and how will this package impact both the level of the amount of plastic waste and the management of these plastics. So first, the level drops from over 900 megatons to 740 megatons. So it's quite a substantial decrease by 2060. But not only is the total amount decreasing following the reduction in plastic use, it's also shifting in terms of how its end of life is handled. Recycling volumes are actually increasing in absolute values and reaching a total share of 50%. Mostly at the expense of sanitary landfilling and incineration, but also reducing the share of mismanaged waste, which is the total amount of plastic waste is decreased by 50%. So this is the main effect we look for in the policy package. In terms of headline numbers, so we've seen that the package reduces plastics use by 17%, plastics waste a bit more because it also it affects also the stocks of plastics that are present in use currently by 21%, as well as and mismanaged wastes even more so is decreasing by 50%. This is basically a very, very low economic cost. GDP is projected to be reduced by 1% in line with consumption, and there is a small drop in employment by 0.2%. I just wanted to emphasize that this is quite an ambitious package because by 2060, the levels of mismanaged waste are not only decreasing, but below 20% below current levels, despite both population and income growth. And with this slide, I'll conclude. So the main messages are that without additional policy action, plastic growth will almost triple between 2019 and 2060, driven by economic growth and, of course, because it happens mostly in OECD countries, a stronger increase in non-OECD countries. The increasing use of plastics leads to higher plastic waste amounts as well. And despite the fact that we are making progress on waste management, mismanaged waste is projected to increase. And the preliminary circular plastics policy package that we implemented reduces plastics throughout the life cycle, so plastics use, plastic waste, as well as mismanaged plastic waste quite substantially. The next step in our analysis is to further rework the policy package calibration. We are probably going to further work on the investments for improving recyclability and decreasing and improving collection rates. We also want to look at a variety of other policy scenarios, including scenarios in which only a part of the world acts on its own, for instance, OECD countries. We also want to look at environmental impacts, not least of which are greenhouse gas emissions. As Maxime was showing, there is a significant improvement in terms of greenhouse gas emissions when you go from primary to secondary. So we want to examine that as well. And with this, I think I'm on time, and I thank you for your attention. And welcome any questions.
Thanks, Ruben. There's a hand up from Ala, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, for all the plastics that you model, is there such thing as theoretical maximum of the recycling rate? How much you can, in theory, how much you're able to recycle?
That's a very good question. In terms of recycling per se, I would say there is no theoretical maximum. There are, however, a few limiting factors. The first, but probably I would disappoint you in saying we don't model them. The first one is recycling capacities. So you need to install the not only the sorting capacities, but also the capacities to recycle the plastics. It can be either chemical or mechanical recycling. So there's a bit, especially chemical recycling is quite expensive. So it's an issue. The main issue, though, then when you talk about plastics recycling is probably contamination. In our heads, we all think about plastics as polymers that are very homogeneous. However, when you think about the objects, they have a combination of different polymers, additives to make them stronger, more flexible, different colors, and all of those things tend to reduce recyclability. So yes, there are limits, but that's also what we're trying to look at by quantifying, for instance, eco-design. We're trying to look at how much more recyclable can we make plastics in the future. I just want to add a disclaimer that we're looking at a global analysis, so probably we won't go into the details of what you're thinking about, but we're thinking about it. Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
There is another question in the chat. So since plastic use is decreasing in the policy scenario, what are the substitutes for plastics, or is the demand just disappearing?
It's actually not a substitution of both, a combination of both. There is part of the demand that is disappearing. For instance, we are implementing eco-design and repair, which are leading to a shift, a qualitative shift in how you consume. If you think about repairing, you add, as I was giving that example, I think you add a year or two to a car. So probably you won't buy another car for another year or two. And because of that, you're reducing the aggregate demand for plastics because you're consuming less cars, but it can also be less appliances, different kind of things. And while part of the eco-design is to improve recyclability, so it doesn't really deal with that. Another part is to increase the lifetime or the repair, the fact that we can repair objects. So that will do. However, and the second part of the explanation is also true. There are substitutes for plastics, and we are trying to work on combining the analysis that we did a few years ago on materials and see how would material use increase for the other materials. For instance, metals, glass, other kind of materials would increase, or paper even. Would increase, but that's still a bit ahead of us. There are substitution in the economic flows, but we're not there yet in terms of quantifying the tons of material substituted. Thank you for the question.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, this is Maxim. I have a question. Thanks, Ruben, for the nice presentation. So I have the question, but maybe before that, a quick comment to Ala's question. So at least in terms of what is actually observed by countries, there are multiple countries with recycling rates around 40–50% plastics. At least that's what can be found in the literature. While global average, I think, is below 10%, something like that. So definitely there is a huge scope for improvement. So at least from what is actually observed in some countries and global average. My question to Ruben is the following. So you mentioned an lifetime extension, essentially, of some commodities. So I was wondering, how do you model this? How do you implement corresponding first costs to this? Because this was definitely kind of like imply some costs and maybe some policy instruments if you have. And the second, how do you implement it in the model so that you show that the plastic materials now are used, plastics is used for a longer time?
I'll answer to the second part first. So we are implementing basically a demand shock for the sectors in which plastics is used. For instance, and I speak under the control of Eleonora because she's the master modeler behind the policy scenarios. In the electronics sectors, we say the lifetime of electronics, of plastics and electronics, is going to be increased, and that means that there will be a corresponding demand shock for electronics. But it's not only this sector; it's also services. It's also I forget now. Sorry. Give me 1 second to remind me. Motor vehicles. So electronics, there's 4 different sectors, sorry. Motor vehicles, electronics, construction, and I'm missing one, but it'll come back to me. And we implement demand shocks for those sectors, so there is a decrease in demand shocks in demand. So
kind of like more efficient use, you can say, yeah, efficiency increase in the intermediate demand for plastics in this sense. So they have less plastics to achieve the same level of output, or?
It's the demand for households. Sorry.
Oh, so it's end use demand.
Yes, for this specific, that wasn't actually an issue. We haven't, for the moment, touched on the plastics that's contained in intermediate demands. And the first part of the question is the cost associated. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Eleonora, but I think we didn't implement any costs because we don't have any costs from the literature. The only costs that we managed to find that we implemented are costs to investment costs for changing the treatment of waste from, so both collection costs when you have to implement collection rates, for instance, in the lesser developed part of the world like Africa, where collection rates are still quite low. And as well as investment costs for recycling capacities, incineration capacities, and sanitary landfilling capacities. So those we did implement.
Okay. Thanks for clarification. I have one other quick question, if I may.
Sure.
So I did not quite get whether you have explicitly split the primary and secondary plastic production. Yeah, is this the case?
It is the case. I wouldn't be proud of it, but mostly because the data is, well, I mean, I used EXIOBASE again, and for plastics, the regional data are really, really bad. So I decided in the end that for now I was going to use a global technology for primary and secondary. And, the shares are based on the tonnages that I could find. But I know it's incorrect. So that's part of the current work that I'm doing to revise these assumptions.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we would be happy to share the data, at least what we have collected so far.
Please do. Share the whole GTAP-CE database if you want. We'll be happy. And I think it would be a good user for it. So.
Thanks.
Thanks, Maxime.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think that gets us to the end of the session. So, so I'd like to wrap up this session on material resources modeling. I hope you enjoyed this new trend of use of CG models, which I think will lead to nice policy insights. So please help me in thanking our presenters for their very good presentations today. Thanks very much to the three of you. And thanks everybody for joining us. And I hope you have a good rest of the GTAP conference.